Okay, here we go. Here we go. Another day in the life. Oops. All right, here we go. All right, I'm back. Another day in the life. The doggy's outside with her. I think she has a deer femur bone right now. So spoiled. Man, I want to be a dog in the next lifetime. Maybe. Maybe. But anyway, so what are we going to do today? Today, I'm going to crank out a few emails for those who don't have any interest in what I'm going to share today. And so I'll share some emails. I'm going to light up the YouTube on the screen, see if this works out. And we're going to watch this video together. All right? I'm going to donate that time of mine to watch it with you guys. And if you think you got it all figured out, no matter what side of the line you are sitting on, I challenge you to sit and listen to this woman anyway. Be a big boy. Be a big girl. All right? And listen to someone else speak. Listen to what they've done, what they've looked into, the time they've put in, their due diligence, their receipts, and just listen. Or not. Or not. Now, who do we got? What do we got? First off, I caught a quick video clip this morning. I think it was on Joe Rogan and some dude looking into items. Just one of those quick clips where you can hear it or not for a few seconds. And this guy was showing some facts about these stones that were cut somewhere in another foreign country. I got the name here. I wrote it down because it just goes with what I've been trying to share with all the people. As I try to encourage people to think for themselves, as I try to encourage people to realize that everything's a bullshit story from the day one. The second you walk into that public school, you're screwed. And here's another little tidbit of a clue of why or how. With our history. Our history's been manipulated and annihilated forever. Isn't that alarming? Isn't that really weird how we were fed such bullshit when it comes to our true history? Like, we are basically a species with amnesia. 100%. Right? And what happens when your memory is erased? Well, somebody else gets to replace it with something of their choice. Very creepy. Very sinister. Very dark. But why? Why is it that we can't just be given this special, precious gift of life and be able to live it to the max? All truth, happiness, wellness. You know what I mean? Isn't it so bizarre how we've been led down this other route of the opposite direction of good, love, happy, prosperous? You know what I mean? It's pretty creepy. But anyways, listen to this one. It's another little tidbit. Interesting little tidbit. Gotta crack up my phone again. Like I said, I just wrote this note of thought as I'm going along in my day. Our history is so messed, we don't even have a clue how stones were moved and placed years ago. So you can probably Google it up. It's called the Trilithon Stones. 900 tons each. 3 of them were moved over half a mile and placed perfectly in line, 30 feet off the ground. Perfectly cut. One piece. Excuse me. And then they have another one. It's called the Pregnant Lady Stone or Tomb or something. Same place. And this other stone was 68 feet long by 14 feet across. 68 by 14. Square. 1,200 tons. 1,200 tons. It was perfectly cut and moved and placed. And you know what? Not one modern human being knows how. Not what? We don't know how. How come we don't know that one? How come the people that cut those stones didn't easily pass down those stories of how they sweat their balls off cutting those stones and moving them over half a mile perfectly and placing them 30 feet in the air without a crane? Pretty sure indigenous peoples who have had their history, everything passed down verbally and on paintings, etc., for a long time. Well, how come they got to pass on their history, document their history that way and pass it on to next generations? But you go back a certain amount and of time, and there's a complete chop block. No, no. No, we're not going to pass that history down, okay? It stops right here. We don't know what happened back then, okay? Now just walk your little ass to that classroom and sit down and listen to that person up there, and they'll tell you what's up, okay? Just don't even worry about it. Right? Good God, the amount of evidence in our faces. Our history has been erased. We're a species of amnesia, and we are being misled is absolutely mind-boggling. I don't get it. I do not understand how we are such a submissive species on average. It just freaking blows me away. It frustrates the shit out of me. There you go. Why don't we know that history? Why don't we know that history? Why don't we know who actually created the pyramids? Why not? Why don't we know that? How come we're not allowed to know that? Why has that been blocked from us? Right? Uh-oh, adventure dog's knocking on the door. She's part of the family. We gotta let her in. Bobby, coming in? What are you doing? How was that bone? Is that a good one? Alright, now. Alright. Okay, you gotta sit and hang out, alright? We're just getting going here, bubs. Something to chew on anyway. Not the, just wondering how they did it, but why is that history absolutely, perfectly, successfully, easily blocked from us, that history? How come? This next email is titled Bigfoot. I'll start off by saying that I have yet to see a Bigfoot, but wholeheartedly believe that they exist. Now to my stories. I've hunted for over 50 years. At an early age, I was shot by a novice hunter. Ooh, that experience taught me to hunt where others won't and don't. Same. No, I haven't been shot. I've almost been shot a few times. That led me to a topographical map search. I found an area approximately 40 miles north of where I'd been hunting, but impossible to get to. The area had to be reached from another direction. We were talking about a vast area of Northern California that was pristine wilderness with no roads going through it. Hundreds of square miles of beautiful wilderness. And this was first seen by me in the early 1970s. And as I got to know the area, I was amazed at the sheer abundance of wildlife in the area. The deer which I hunted were in great abundance. They typically were in fairly close. They typically were in fairly close to an old logging road, which made access into and out of relatively easily, but the thick underbrush made off-trail travel difficult, as remaining silent was a full-time job. It was not unusual to jump and hear dozens of deer running off that you never got a chance to see. This being the case, my success rate was still high, and once I learned where the water, browse, and bedding areas were, it became easier to harvest. This is my cathedral, as I enjoyed the beauty and experience as much as the hunt and harvest. Same. I hunted with a fellow veteran who shared my passion and ethics. We always brought out more garbage than we created, as we wanted this to always be pristine. As often happens, the demands of work and paying bills took time away from our times in the woods. Yeah, it sucks, doesn't it? But we gotta fund those wars. Now to my first story or encounter. Both of us got off work late on Friday, so we got a very late start. We arrived at where we usually camped around 1:30 a.m. and hastily set up camp and laid down. We were up at about 4 a.m. and had a very quick bite, then grabbed our gear and drove 2 miles back the way we'd come in. On the drive, I decided that I would climb above the road about 350 yards and sit on a very large rock. This rock was on the western edge of a ridge and was on the northeast end of a large bowl. The bowl was about 150 yards across and about 450 yards in length. Over the years, many deer had been harvested, going from their forage and watering to their beds on the east side of the ridge. I got on top of the rock, and just as day was breaking, My buddy had dropped off the road to head towards the creek. I was going to circle around and then climb back uphill, and I would see him somewhere across from me in 2 to 3 hours. As the sun began to climb, I was astonished that there was no sign of life. No squirrels, no birds, no rabbits, nothing. About an hour after I'd been on the rock, I heard a faint noise behind me, so I slowly turned to see my buddy. He motioned for me to come down. When we were now together, he asked a few strange questions. Had I seen any signs of life? I said no. We stood there for about a minute, and he suggested that we get about 50 yards apart and slowly work over the ridge and about 150 downhill before heading back to the truck. I walked to the edge of the tree line and waited for him to get about 50 yards further down the ridge. We both started in at the same time. Usual still hunt procedure. 1 step, stop, and look. 1 step, stop, and look. Time consuming, but it works. Darn tootin' it works. I'd gone about 65 or 70 yards when I saw a slight wisp of steam on the other side of a downed log. I slowly worked my way over there, which was maybe 25 yards from where I'd first seen the steam. I was expecting to jump a bit of deer, and had already shouldered my rifle. And what I saw next surprised and scared me. I was looking at a doe that had been decapitated. It had just happened. I gave a short whistle to alert my buddy. He later told me that the look on my face was that of panic. He stopped hunting and immediately came to where I was standing. He immediately asked, where was the head? The head could be seen about 15 feet away downhill. Oh, no way. This is creepier than shit. His next statement put us both in combat mode. He said, whatever did this is still here. We went back to back and he gave the command to move. I was walking backwards and was walking facing direction of travel. When we got back on top, we both hot-footed it back to the truck. We drove back to camp, broke camp, and left. On the way out, we spoke. He asked if I had stayed on the rock. I had. He asked if I had heard anything. I said no, not even birds or squirrels. He asked what I thought I'd done this. My only response was, not a bear, because we only have black bears in that area. We had about a 35-mile drive on very bad, no longer maintained logging roads before we came to the fire station, then the ranger station. We stopped to report it at the ranger station. The ranger laughed and said it was a bear. Yeah, it's pretty funny, right? It always makes everybody laugh when you hear about a deer getting decapitated. That's pretty funny. We left. As we drove, my buddy said, that was no bear. He then said that he did not plan on telling anyone ever. And that was in 1979. That is so freaking frustrating to me. As you guys know, always frustrates me. Uh-oh, better not tell anyone. Absolutely mind-boggling. How did we get there? How did we get there? How did our minds get there so commonly to go, huh? So freaking bizarre to me. I did not hunt that area ever again. And really had not planned to ever... I did not hunt that area again, and I really had not planned to ever again. Then in 1986, I was working with a young man that came from a broken marriage. He had known me for a couple of years and had seen several pictures of my various hunts. He begged me to take him hunting. He even went to hunter safety and had gotten his license. He bugged me every day to tell him what zone and to take him hunting. Finally, on a Friday night after work, I told him I'd get a pizza and we'll talk. I told him of the abundance of game in this area. He asked me if that is where I used to hunt and why I no longer do if this is so good. I then told him the story. He laughed and said it was a bear. Laughed again because it's pretty funny, right? And that he wasn't afraid. I told him that's all fine. And well, until you encounter something that points to the fact that whatever it is most certainly bigger and stronger than a bear, A bear most certainly can and will kill a deer. That's not in the dispute. However, we are talking about a black bear that is maybe, on a really good day, 250 pounds. They could decapitate a deer. It most likely would not have the distance between the body and head. After much pestering, he convinced me to take him there. Much had changed since the last time I'd been there. The road had been improved, and there were more roads and spur roads. This has brought more hunters to the area. Not overhunted, but it had gone from a pristine wilderness to an improved national forest. There were now several primitive camps. We made it to where I wanted to camp just as we were losing light. We slept in the back of my truck, and I got up at 4 a.m. and made breakfast. We drove to a canyon that I was sure that we would see game. We hadn't been in the canyon for even an hour, and I spotted a fork. A fork by 3. That's a buck with 2 points on one side, 3 on the other antler, for all those who aren't familiar. We spotted a fork by 3 about 150 yards out. I stopped and let him catch up. I told him there was a legal buck in the open on the edge of the brush. And if he were to slowly move off the trail and to a scrub oak, he could take a solid rest and harvest the buck. And I was behind him. And when he was ready, I pointed out the buck. He shot, and down went the buck. He immediately jumped up and headed uphill into the brush. Not what I was hoping, and not a good sign. Most mortally wounded animals head downhill. Time to track. I took a 15-minute break and then said, let's go find your buck. We got to where the buck went down, and there was a little dark blood and a very small tuft of fur. The buck was slightly quartered away, so I had instructed my buddy to line up the last rib and the opposite shoulder and squeeze a shot. It was now looking like he had hit low and back. Not good. The buck was bleeding, which at least we could follow. We'd not gone 20 yards into the brush, and it was getting thicker and thicker. I told him that I was going to lead, as this was now a hands and knees operation. The buck was still headed uphill. We went about 150 yards when the buck now turned and headed downhill. After another 60 yards, we encountered a very large cedar that had fallen. And as it began to stand up while fighting brush, I could smell it. I've skinned multiple bears and know the smell well. What I was now smelling was damp, putrid fur with the strong smell of urine. Ugh. I froze and quickly scanned the area. I tried very hard to keep my composure. I looked down and saw a few drops of blood, and the tracks had followed the downed tree. Just then, the buck, which had been bedded, stood up. I put the finishing shot and told my buddy to stand guard. His response was, "What the F stinks?" My gut job was about all of 6 minutes. I grabbed one side, he grabbed the other, and we just broke brush and got the hell out of there. We were back at the road in about 30 minutes, hot and sweaty, and I told him to tag the buck and I'd get the truck. We loaded the buck and all our gear was ready in the truck as we had slept in the bed. Then I drove for 20 minutes before I found an oak next to the road, hung the buck, skinned him. I bagged the buck and we were headed home. About an hour later, he asked what had smelled so bad. I said, I don't know, but it wasn't a bear. I'd skinned several bears and had never smelled one like that. He asked me if I was going to hunt, and I said yes, but not today, and not there. About 15 years ago, and about 65 miles northwest of this, I was hunting by myself, my preferred method. Mine too. It was early morning. And I was about 3 miles from the truck on the top of a ridge. I heard the howls of a wolf pack that was talking to each other. They were in the same basic area, but not all together. There were 3 ridges over from me. I stood there and listened, as this is California, and there aren't supposed to be wolves. You mean they don't know there's a border? A state border? Crazy. At least not then. I reported this to the game warden a couple days later with pretty good location. His response is that I'd heard coyotes. I don't report shit to nobody, man. Never. Except my fellow people in my community, that's it. I I'd heard coyotes, and I've hunted coyotes my entire life, and what I heard was not anything like a coyote. This is not investigated at all. This is now the area where Fish and Game was forced to admit that there is an established pack because of calf kills and a radio-collared female wolf at the scene of the kills. Astonishing. Two things. First, is that I normally don't discuss contact because of the usual response. Same. The person in the first story recently asked if I'd ever been back. I told him of the second encounter and stated, I do not have to see Bigfoot to know that they are real. They are apparently highly intelligent and seek to be left alone. I will respect their wishes. The second is that Fish and Game, as all government entities, do not know everything. If they do, for whatever reason, choose not to share or even tell the truth, you're free to use this, but please not my name. Okay, you know what, you guys, in the future, anybody, don't use my name at the beginning. Okay, and now I gotta go back check the beginning. And there's no name, I didn't read your name. Okay. Boom, there you go. I appreciate you sending that share in. Have I ever had that happen? Right away my memory went straight back to a time near Whistler, British Columbia, where I was bow hunting. And it's up near this rock pile, big boulders, snow on the ground. And I'm looking, and I can see wisps of steam coming up from the holes down in those boulders. And I remember just sitting there kind of frozen and watching it, looking all around. There's no soft ground anywhere to have burrowed a bear to make a den underneath. I mean, we're talking boulders. I cannot estimate the weight of a boulder because I've never weighed a boulder. But the boulders were like, I don't know, 5 foot square-ish, rectangular-ish, broken up in a rock slide, 4 foot boulders. All crashed down and all those big gaping holes down in there, right? And there's steam coming up from one spot in the whole rocks. And that's another thing too. You always look for pattern. It's like glassing too. For glassing for game, you see something that looks the color of maybe it's an animal. I immediately start to looking for other blotches the exact same color to make sure it's not something else. Because it's usually if it's boulders, stumps, trees that are thrown in off shape, you'll see that exact same color around as a pattern where you're looking at. So I'm looking around. I started looking around the whole rock pile, looking for steam coming from anywhere else as a pattern to something natural. Nothing. Just steam coming up from that one hole right there and about 50 yards from me. I wasn't scared, but it definitely made me feel a little leery. I was not going to go over there. It was really weird, but that's the only time I've seen steam like that. And then, of course, coming across fresh kills. I told this story in a YouTube video story a long time ago. Had my hunter. My hunter was walking his horse. We always get off the horses and walk down the steep hill and save the front ends, right? And we're off of our horses walking down this old trail. Outfitter trail, horse trail in the woods. And it was this camp I'm in, they've been outfitting there since the late 60s. So you're finding old blazes on trees and old trails and stuff. And here's this trail. And it's heading down towards camp instead of going all the way around this valley to get back for the evening. It's evening light. And the thermals had already changed, but it wasn't windy, so the cold air is just sinking. If you stand still, you can feel the coolness on the back of your neck as the cold air sinks down. So that tells me that anything down that trail ahead of me knows I'm coming already. So I'm not even in stealth. I'm just walking down the trail. Look down. It's raining that day, and here is these huge grizzly tracks. Brand new, in that damp soil, facing me, where you can see where he stopped dead. He walked up the trail, stopped dead. And you can see his front prints moved around like this a little bit, as he was probably going like that, smelling me coming. And then I'm like, oh wow. And there's a Mexican national. I go, hey man, you want to see a big grizzly bear track? He's right here. And it's thick spruce, but muskeggy. So the spruce were kind of stunted. They're probably 8 to 10 foot spruce trees on that 2 foot muskeggy moss. And I go, hey, you want to see a big grizzly bear print? Come here. He's right here. He's listening to us right now. He was coming up. I call it the main highway. When you come up the main game trail, it's the public highway with all wildlife, right? Including us. And everybody knows to step off and let whoever's going by go by, and they'll step on and keep going. It's just the way it goes. And this bear, I thought, had stepped off because he could smell us coming. We're in a head-on collision, I thought. And then I go, yeah. He goes, oh, wow, big one? I go, yeah, it's a big bear, man. And he's listening to us talk right now. He's right here beside us in these trees, waiting for us to go by, as I usually thought. And then we carry on walking. I'm off my horse. And I walked another 10 yards. Slight corner, I look down, and you can just tell him that big, cushy moss everywhere on the ground. I'm like, holy shit, something just happened here. What's all this about? And I look down on the downhill slope of the trail. Here's a cow moose on her back. I'll never forget. The steam from the story reminded me of this. And there's steam coming up from her mouth and nostrils. He had just killed her. Just. Hadn't moved her. Hadn't fed on her. Nothing. Imagine we just missed that scuffle too. That would have been... I never even thought of that. Imagine with that, because there's no wind, dead silent in the evening. You imagine if all of a sudden we heard that fight going on in the thick spruce on our trail right there on the other side of the bushes. We probably would have, if the wind had been coming the other way, we probably would have got to hear it. That would have been crazy. That would have been a crazy ass experience. But anyway, and the second I saw that moose, everything went slow motion. Because on average, your average bear takes you down and kills you when you bump into them on their kill. Thankfully, this is a big, old, mature, very intelligent grizzly bear who knew we weren't stalking him. He knew we were coming with the wind, which I like to think makes us innocent in his eyes. And he's probably just went off the side of the trail because he knows we're bad. He's old enough. He's probably seen a bunch of grizzly carcasses from us killing him in the past, which educates the shit out of him. And he didn't attack. And now remember, get on your horse, get on your horse, get on your horse now. I'm just saying, get on your horse. The safest place when you bump into a grizzly, when horse world, is on your horse. And I remember slinging my leg up over that saddle. Absolute slow motion. And it's like, just in a way, you're waiting to feel those teeth rip into your ass cheek as you're trying to get on the horse as fast as you can. And then we just bucked her down that trail. Sorry for the little ramble, a little story of mine from back in the day. The steam, the fresh kill. But anyway, it'd be interesting to know how that doe was decapitated, right? Too bad. I get it. He's here right now. Whatever did this is here right now. Just like that grizzly. It's not like I was going to go and play with the frickin' cow moose. Get me out of here. So I can totally relate to you. Get me out of here. But man, too bad. It would have been interesting to see if there was a mark of impact on the doe's head. Obviously, it got knocked off and flew from the impact. The head flew from that deer's body. So, was that a stick, a hand, a boulder, a rock that hit it so hard it ripped its head off? And if it was, you would easily see the impact mark on that deer's head. Or was it just grabbed? It'd be crazy to see that go down, wouldn't it? Anyway. Alright, give me a minute. Let me get this thing set up here. And I'm going to go into listening to this video. Why do I want to listen to this video? I'll tell you in a minute. Stay there, Bobby. Stay there. Alright, here we go. So you guys can watch that screen. I'll watch the laptop. It's the same deal. And if any commercials come up, I'll fast forward it. But anyways, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because it's easier for me to possibly argue back or share some points from what I've been looking into and learning for myself when it comes to what's going on globally, right? What's really going on. And it affects every one of us because it's our time of life that we use to create money. And then these dirty bastards take it, and then they do this with it. So it affects every single one of you, regardless if you want to look away or not. So yeah, I'm going to challenge a lot, especially people that always, if I ever bring up the WAR, the war, A lot of people just automatically lash out and they'll say, "Oh, you're a Putin apologist," or they'll say, "Oh yeah, what about the Russians invaded a sovereign country illegally?" Holy shit! There's nothing that triggers me in a way as that statement. As soon as I hear that statement, the only thought that comes to my head is, "Holy shit! There's another one that got hook, line, and sinker." Amazing how somebody can just sprack off that statement freely, publicly. Because once I show you this, if you are big enough to listen to this woman, who's probably smarter than myself and a lot of other people combined, just listen to her. Listen to the facts. I've been looking into this topic for a long time. I've been following it for a long time, all the way back to years ago. I remember specifically Putin saying flat out, "They're coming for us." When Obama got into power, he knew they're coming for us. And take note, if you ever want to know the true history of Russia, look at their history. And you'll see that Putin is actually a very passionate historian when it comes to his country. He loves his country, regardless of how you feel about him. I don't know the guy. Sure, he's done some evil shit. I think you cannot not do evil shit to be in power of any country currently, or for a long time. But anyway, the guy's passionate about his country. He knows the entire history if you listen to him. And, oh no, my brain farted. Our popular journalist, American journalist, big Trump supporter. Damn it. Sometimes my brain just farts. Anyway, listen to this woman. For me, I've already been aware of all this. She nails it on the head. But so many people in the world don't know this. Mainstream's not going to play this. Whose channel is this? I don't know. I don't know this guy. Am I encouraging to subscribe to this channel? Not at all. I want you to listen to this woman, and I'm willing to sit here the whole time and listen to her with you, okay? I think it's very, very important. That's why I'm doing this.
You're about to see is a highly informative talk by a German intellectual and former journalist, Gabriele Krone-Schmalz, who used to work as a Moscow correspondent for Germany's largest public broadcaster. Dr. Krone-Schmalz was also a professor for media science and has emerged as one of the fiercest critics of Germany's foolish policies vis-à-vis Russia. She's one of the people who can and does publicly lecture on the true origins of the ongoing warfare in Europe. And she has proved that, yes, some Europeans really do know what is going on and how reckless the current political and media elite are. I'm able to show you this in English translation thanks to the open access publication of the original video, courtesy by the Nachdenkseiten, Germany's most important independent media portal. Please consider supporting them. And now, enjoy.
Thank you very much. I warmly greet you all. Yes, Russia and what next? May I begin with a quote? I was never discouraged before. I never despaired of the fatherland. But now, having seen its saviors, all hope has left me. This quote is from Heinrich Heine, and I read it a few weeks ago in the Nachdenkseiten, in an article that dealt with the state of our democracy. I fundamentally consider democratic systems to be the most humane way to organize coexistence. However, one must not forget, democracies rely on the so-called informed citizen if they are to function. A citizen can only be informed if firstly they receive education and secondly they are continuously and comprehensively informed.
Und zweitens laufend, umfassend informiert wird. Dass beides nicht so ohne weiteres gegeben ist, bei der Bildung.
Both education and comprehensive information, in my opinion, are not readily available. Regarding education, there is likely consensus that there is still much room for improvement. This is less the case with the quality of reporting. These deficiencies endanger democracy and ultimately peace, which is known to be more than just the absence of war. Journalism is an important pillar to provide stability to a democracy. The task of continually deciding what makes it into the news, what should be reported, and what must necessarily be omitted is very responsible. Because often, one does not have the choice between right and wrong, but only between wrong and wrong. I know this from my own experience.
Sondern nur zwischen falsch und falsch. Also alles schwierig und kompliziert. Umso wichtiger, den Bürger.
Everything is difficult and complicated. It is all the more important to take the citizens seriously and provide them with all available information. This should happen regardless of one's own stance in a debate. One should also resist the temptation to want to make politics oneself instead of explaining it. A respectful and contentious debate on these topics could increase the chances of finding sustainable and peaceful solutions. This applies not only with regard to Russia and Ukraine. This is how I understand my work. In any case, I am not willing to leave the field to those who claim interpretive authority for themselves alone and believe they have a moral justification for it.
Und meinen dafür auch noch so etwas wie eine moralische Berechtigung zu haben. Also Russland und wie weiter? Um diese Frage beantworten zu können, ist
So, Russia and what next? To answer this question, it's important to know the background and understand what has led us to the current situation. This background doesn't just start with the Russian attack on Ukraine, but much earlier. Essentially, it begins with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By the way, this is a revealing example of the use of language. In the West, we often speak of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In reality, however, it was a more or less politically driven dissolution. But that's just an aside, as I will delve more deeply into language later. So the background essentially begins with the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Beginnt also im Grunde mit der Auflösung der Sowjetunion. Und es kann nicht schaden, sich ein paar Eckpunkte nochmal ins Gedächtnis zu rufen.
And it doesn't hurt to recall a few key points. You tend to forget things so quickly, as you will soon see. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union opened up to the West in an unprecedented way. This powerful spirit of change is hardly describable in words. The hopes and expectations were enormous. However, what was demanded of the people was also immense, but it was not really acknowledged in its significance by the political West. Essentially, there were three revolutions that took place and had to be managed. The first was the transition from a planned economy to a market economy. It sounds simple, but it means a lot. People from the former East Germany generally understand this better than those in the western part of Germany.
Besser als die Menschen im westlichen Teil Deutschlands. Und für Russland kommt erschwerend noch hinzu,
And for Russia, in addition to its size, it is particularly challenging that the Russian economy was not ruined by the planned economy, but created by it. That is a significant difference. The second revolution was the transition from the dictatorship of the Communist Party to constitutional structures. Who today is still aware that the leadership claim of the Communist Party was enshrined in the Soviet Constitution? The Constitution had to be changed. Initially, the path seemed to lead straightforwardly to constitutional structures. The Constitution is not the problem today, but rather the constitutional reality. There have been massive setbacks in that regard. And the third revolution was the transition from the Soviet Union to a nation state, which for a long time was not recognized as a problem in the West at all.
You're not a child, you're a man. So stop wearing so many layers to go outside and get the bearskin tactical.
Lange Zeit im Westen überhaupt nicht als Problem erkannt. Bitte bedenken Sie dabei auch, dass für alle Verbrechen und Verletzungen.
Please also consider that for all the crimes and violations committed by the Soviet Union, the West has generally held Russia responsible. All other states that emerged after the dissolution of the Soviet Union were given the chance by the West for a more or less unburdened new beginning. But not Russia. This fundamental attitude is not insignificant, as it forms the basis for quickly reviving old enemy images. The Russians were and are seen as the villains. Stalin is also not perceived as a Georgian, but as someone from Russia. How did it continue? Then came Boris Yeltsin, who was initially seen as a beacon of hope, both in the West and in Russia, as a reformer and democrat.
Als der Reformer, der Demokrat. Aber der russische Alltag wurde sehr bald beherrscht von Wildwestkapitalismus.
But Russian everyday life was soon dominated by Wild West capitalism, corruption, and great chaos. There were chaotic conditions that we can hardly imagine in our relatively structured country. Yeltsin, through dubious privatizations of key industries, became the midwife of the oligarchs, the money elite. Under him, an unprecedented sell-off of the country took place. He gave it away more than he sold it. Not only Russian oligarchs benefited from this, but also the West, and significantly so. As bad as all this is, the worst part is that all the nice Western terms like liberalization and democratization sounded good in theory, but in practice they turned out to be pure chaos for the people in Russia, not the promised paradise.
Nicht als das verheißene Paradies, sondern als das pure Chaos. Und das konnte ja kaum erstrebenswert sein. Damit waren diese
And that could hardly be desirable. As a result, these terms were permanently damaged. I'm not even talking about the shelling of the Russian parliament that Yeltsin ordered in 1993. That was also rather undemocratic, but in line with the West. Therefore, this act was not criticized as it normally should have been, considering Western values. Instead, it was celebrated. What were the citizens of Russia supposed to think of that? The exact occurrences and the chronology of events can be read about. In this chaos, in this situation where criminal structures were the only reliable thing, Putin came just in time.
Ein junger, gesunder, sportlicher Mann,
a young, healthy, athletic man who, with his politics and demeanor, has given people in Russia back their self-confidence and self-assurance. Instead of seizing the opportunities and finally building the common European house, whose vision Mikhail Gorbachev had developed, Western observers only criticized that Putin was a KGB man. That alone says nothing. On the one hand, the KGB in the late 1980s dealt with its criminal past in an unprecedented way. There's an ARD production by me titled KGB Crime and Glasnost on this topic.
Titel KGB Verbrechen und Glasnost. Und zum anderen hat Putin im Zusammenhang mit dem
And on the other hand, Putin said in connection with the failed coup attempt in the summer of 1991, you may recall, when a group around KGB chief Kryuchkov wanted to seize power, tanks rolled through Moscow, and Gorbachev was held with his family in Crimea. Putin resigned from his service at exactly this time. That means when it was not yet foreseeable that this coup would fail. That is a clear statement. But such details only disturb. The fact is that during his first term, Putin made many offers of cooperation to the West. Mr. Miller also mentioned some proposals, all of which were either ignored or immediately rejected.
As usual.
Entweder ignoriert oder gleich zurückgewiesen worden sind. Und das ist keine Marginalie, sondern das ist eine
And this is not a trivial matter, but a fundamental experience that shapes further behavior. It is also a fact that during his first term, Putin highly valued the importance of a strong civil society and did a lot to develop it. The numerous attempts were either not acknowledged by us at all or were ridiculed. For those who now think that I can say a lot but lack evidence, you can find this in my earlier books, including What is Happening in Russia. It is described there in detail and chronologically what has happened. We were not the least bit interested in that. In times of change, it is especially important to avoid misunderstandings.
Deshalb an dieser Stelle eine Zwischenbemerkung.
Therefore, a brief remark at this point. When I point out Western mistakes, it does not mean that I am claiming, conversely, that Russia is faultless and merely the poor victim. Those are not the categories in which I think. When I explain and analyze Putin's policies in his early days as president, it has nothing to do with justifying his later activities, both domestically and internationally. Explaining is not the same as justifying. This is one of the great misunderstandings of our time. I focus on Western mistakes for two reasons. First, they are less often highlighted in our context, so I try to balance that out in a certain way.
Also versuche ich in gewisser Weise auszugleichen. Und zum anderen sollte man sie kennen, sie nicht zu wiederholen.
On the other hand, one should know them in order not to repeat them. This brings us to the fundamental question that needs to be answered. Is Russia pursuing imperialistic interests, or is Russia concerned with a functioning security architecture that includes Russia? This must be debated based on facts, meaning analytically and not ideologically or morally.
Here we go.
It doesn't help when German politicians create threat scenarios and warn of, I quote, Putin's great power fantasies, or when experts develop timelines suggesting that the Russians will be in Berlin in 5 years. Such statements tend to incite fear rather than result from a sober assessment of the situation.
Eher dazu, Angst zu schüren, als dass sie das Ergebnis einer nüchternen Lagebeurteilung wären. Selbst der NATO-Generalsekretär Stoltenberg, der ja nicht unbedingt wegen
Even NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who is not exactly known for his restraint towards Russia, recently stated that there is currently no threat from Russia. Similar sentiments can be found in various U.S. strategy papers. So why this scaremongering? If the enormous efforts to support Ukraine financially and with weapons in the war against Russia are to continue, the fear of a Russian attack beyond Ukraine must be stoked. This way, the population is led to support all of this without resistance. This includes the claim that our democracy and freedom are being defended in Ukraine.
Unsere Demokratie, unsere Freiheit würde in der Ukraine verteidigt. Das stimmt diesmal genauso wenig, wie es damals in Afghanistan gestimmt hat.
This is just as untrue this time as it was back then in Afghanistan, when it was said that our freedom and democracy were being defended in the Hindu Kush. Unfortunately, there are repeated examples in history that show friend-enemy images, and the demonization of the opponent served to make an entire society ready for war. Our Minister of Defense, who is not called the Minister of War, increasingly uses the terms war-capable and war-ready instead of defensible and capable of defense. This does not happen to him by accident.
Wehrhaft und verteidigungsfähig. Das unterläuft ihm ja nicht aus Versehen. Eine systematische, Chronologie ist dabei besonders.
A systematic and chronological examination of Russian statements and Russian policy repeatedly shows that Moscow is concerned with securing an appropriate place in the new security architecture. This became necessary after the East-West confrontation seemed to have been overcome at the end of the 1980s. After the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO should have sensibly restructured itself. There were plans that at times did not even exclude Russia's membership. NATO was originally founded as a defense alliance.
Die NATO war mal als Verteidigungsbündnis gegründet worden. Nur der Feind, also Sowjetunion oder Russland, der existierte ja nicht.
Only the enemy, namely the Soviet Union or Russia, no longer existed. So a new task was needed, and the out-of-area missions, meaning operations outside one's own territory, were proclaimed. From my perspective, that was the beginning of the end. Instead of including the vast Russia in some way in security policy, NATO did not change structurally, but merely expanded eastward. There was the NATO-Russia Council, but it was more of a cosmetic correction and not participation on equal terms. The NATO eastward expansion was, in any case, one of the biggest mistakes since the end of World War II.
Jedenfalls einer der größten Fehler seit dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs.
Most people have no clue that in 2024, the best way to make money with Amazon is not by selling physical products.
NATO expansion. Who'd have thunk?
Das hat unter anderem auch der langjährige deutsche Außenminister Hans-Dietrich Genscher so gesagt.
The long-serving German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher saw it that way, among others. And what might be even more telling, even George Kennan, essentially the architect of the American containment policy, said at the time, and I quote verbatim, "I think this is a tragic mistake. There was absolutely no reason for it. No one is threatening anyone." And a bit further, he says, "Of course, there will be a nasty reaction from Russia in the future. And then you, the NATO expanders, will say, that's how they are, the Russians. We've always told you, but that is completely wrong." George Kennan, who to my knowledge is not identified with the current meaning of Russia understander.
Mit der NATO-Perspektive für die Ukraine.
With the NATO perspective for Ukraine, an immediate neighbor with special historical and emotional significance for Russia, the breaking point was reached. Russia's security needs are often ridiculed on the political agenda of the West. It is argued, giant country, who would threaten it? But a look at the map and strategic papers shows that the breakup of Russia and a regime change in Moscow are being pursued. A crucial security policy difference between Russia and the USA lies simply in geography.
Der sicherheitspolitische Unterschied zwischen Russland und den USA besteht schlicht in der Geografie. Die USA haben westlich und östlich ihres Landes Ozeane vor der Tür.
The USA has oceans to the west and east of its country. In the north, it has Canada as a NATO partner, and in the south, the country borders Mexico, from which there is no security risk for the USA. The situation is quite different for Russia. Russia spans a vast landmass with over 22,000 kilometers of land borders, which are difficult to defend over long stretches. Russia has 14 neighbors, not just 2, and with some of these countries, the relationships are heavily strained. From a security perspective, this is a qualitatively different task, which naturally leads to different sensitivities.
Was man auch nicht vergessen sollte,
what should not be forgotten are Russia's historically developed fears. We are always programmed to acknowledge the historically developed fears of Poland and the Baltic states. That is correct. But we do not acknowledge Russia's historical fears. In 1904, Russia was attacked in the east by Japan. In World War I, German troops occupied large parts of Russia. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1917 meant painful losses and extremely harsh conditions for Moscow.
Schmerzliche Verluste und äußerst schwere Bedingungen. In den anschließenden russischen Bürgerkrieg griff das westliche Aus.
In the subsequent Russian Civil War, Western foreign countries intervened, led by France and Great Britain. What is often overlooked is that Poland tried to exploit Russia's weakness after World War I to expand its territory eastward, specifically beyond the line that was supposed to form Poland's eastern border during the peace negotiations. Interwar Greater Poland thus annexed exactly the Soviet territories that Stalin reclaimed in 1939. And of course, not to forget the German invasion in 1941 with all its immeasurable suffering and unimaginable cruelty.
Und unvorstellbarer Grausamkeit. Weiter zurückliegend, aber durchaus noch präsent, ist auch der französische Angriff.
Further back, but still quite present, is the French attack under Napoleon in 1812. Russian fears and feelings of threat have a real background. These fears are in absolute contrast to the USA. Due to this combination of historical experiences and geographical location, the threat situation presents itself very differently for Russia. Because of the high number of American military bases around the world, it can rightly be said that NATO has encircled Russia and is now also moving closer to the Russian national borders from the west.
Right? Eben auch von Westen her immer näher an russische Landesgrenzen. Nochmal zum Vergleich. Oder nur mal zum Vergleich.
Once again for comparison, Russia operates 11 military bases outside its own country, 9 of which are in close proximity to Russia. The USA operates almost 800 military bases in more than 70 countries around the world.
Who's the aggressor?
So who is threatening whom here? It doesn't matter at all whether a threat actually exists or is only perceived as such. That is enough to destroy the foundation of peaceful coexistence or even cooperation. This foundation would be a minimum of trust. And where is that supposed to come from in the current situation? I would argue that mutual distrust has never...
11 Russian military bases outside of the country and close to the border, and over 800 U.S. military bases around the globe. What do you think of that? Just that alone.
...been as great as it is now.
Das gegenseitige Misstrauen war noch nie so groß wie jetzt. Dazu tragen natürlich auch solche Äußerungen bei wie die von Frau Merkel.
Such statements, like those from Mrs. Merkel, naturally contribute to this. She said that the Minsk agreements were only made to give Ukraine time to become more defensible. In other words, the agreements themselves were not meant seriously. That is a devastating signal.
There's receipts for that. How's that one? How's that for a dirty, filthy, sleazy move? But it's Russia's the bad guys. Russia. Right?
I make agreements at all then. Let's look at the recent past from a Russian perspective. There was the Kosovo War in 1999 and the Iraq War in 2003. Both wars were led by the USA without the approval of the UN Security Council, so to speak, out of their own authority, where international rules no longer played a role. It was not Moscow that tried to reshape the world. It was the USA or the political West.
Beziehungsweise der politische Westen. Dazu passt die Aufkündigung fast aller Abrüstungsverträge.
This aligns with the termination of almost all disarmament treaties, some of which had historical significance. Just consider that the INF Treaty actually succeeded in not only limiting, but abolishing and destroying an entire category of weapons. Again, it was not Moscow that terminated the treaties, but the USA. In this context, it is worth looking at the chronology of mutual accusations regarding who allegedly violated the treaties and when. The often mentioned Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad were a countermeasure to the missile defense system stationed by the USA in Poland and Romania. It is important to know that these defense systems can be easily converted into offensive systems.
Diese Abwehrsysteme sich technisch ganz leicht in Angriffssysteme umwandeln lassen. Das ist alles nicht so schwarz-weiß, wie es uns oftmals suggeriert wird.
It's not all as black and white as it's often suggested to us. To draw the connection to Ukraine now, the US involvement in Ukraine is indeed remarkable. I'm not just talking about the enormous sums that have repeatedly been used to influence elections in Ukraine or to finance educational programs. These programs are actually called educational programs. They are intended to convey to Ukrainians in all parts of the country that they are better off in NATO. For a long time, there was no majority in the population for this.
Dafür gab es nämlich lange überhaupt keine Mehrheit in der Bevölkerung. Im Gegenteil. Der neutrale Status der Ukraine, der war ja sogar...
On the contrary, Ukraine's neutral status was even enshrined in the constitution. Apart from that, Ukraine has repeatedly been the site of large-scale NATO maneuvers. The US systematically increased the number of reconnaissance flights on the Ukrainian-Russian border. As recently reported in the New York Times, the US has been operating 12 secret CIA bases directly on the Ukrainian-Russian border for about 8 years. According to the New York Times, the involvement of American intelligence agencies is said to have played a key role in the Russian president's decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022.
Do you think? Who wouldn't?
2022 in die Ukraine einzumarschieren. Moskau habe nämlich befürchtet, so kann man da lesen,
Moscow feared that Ukraine could turn into a springboard for operations against Russia with the help of the CIA, the British Foreign Intelligence Service MI6, and other Western agencies. Before the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian president formally requested security guarantees, but they didn't even want to talk to him. I'm not referring to the talks between Scholz and Putin or Macron and Putin at that oversized table, but to how the US reacted. Anyone reminded of the Cold War should have a heightened sense of the situation, because today it is much more dangerous.
Denn heute ist es viel gefährlicher. Nicht umsonst hat man damals vom Gleichgewicht des Schreckens gesprochen.
Not without reason was it referred to as the balance of terror back then. It is precisely about this balance, about calibrating and maintaining second strike capability. This capability deters a potential aggressor from executing the first strike because they must expect to be destroyed as the second. The political West is doing everything to throw this balance off. International treaties often emphasize that the security of one should not be developed or ensured at the expense of another's security. But who still adheres to this? What has become of the communication channels that were created for times of crisis?
Was ist denn aus den Kommunikationskanälen geworden, die für Zeiten der Krisen geschaffen wurden? Der NATO-Russland-Rat und diverse andere Gesprächsforen sind ausgesetzt.
The NATO-Russia Council and various other discussion forums have been suspended or completely abolished. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has become common to hold détente politicians partly responsible for this development, and to blame them for the fact that the Russian attack happened at all. Many of these détente politicians, including well-known ones, are now withdrawing and declaring this policy a regrettable mistake. In my opinion, however, it is exactly the opposite. It is not the détente politicians who are responsible for the current situation, but the fact that they were unable to implement their policies.
Dass sich die Entspannungspolitiker mit ihrer Politik eben nicht haben durchsetzen können.
Do you look at a gorgeous woman and immediately you think to yourself, no, this woman is out of my league. She's unattainable.
Auch darüber könnte und müsste man faktenbasiert.
One could and should argue about this in a fact-based and civilized manner. One should not dismiss every argument that does not align with the current government line as disinformation or fake news to make it undebatable.
Right.
Or even worse, label it as Russian propaganda, which we are supposedly all falling for en masse. One could argue about this endlessly. But what seems much more important to me is to look forward. That is challenging enough. To develop a perspective, it requires a candid assessment and the identification of interests.
Und die Benennung von Interessen. Fangen wir mit den Interessen an. Friedliche Politik.
Let's start with interests. Peaceful politics is nothing more than a functioning balance of interests. It's not about morality, as is often claimed. Even the Democratic presidential candidate in the USA, Kamala Harris, said at the Munich Security Conference regarding American engagement in Europe, "We do this not out of charity, but because it is in our strategic interest." It would be good if Germany and the EU started to formulate their strategic interests.
Anfangen würden, ihre strategischen Interessen zu formulieren.
Strategic interest.
Da gibt es sicher Berührungspunkte mit den USA oder Schnittmengen.
There are certainly points of contact with the USA or overlaps, as we like to say today. But there are also significant differences that should not be underestimated. These differences need to be worked out and clearly identified. For example, it is in the interest of the EU, especially Germany, to maintain good relations with Russia. Likewise, it is in Russia's interest to have good relations with the EU and Germany. We are not only neighbors, but also natural partners who complement each other. However, this is not at all in the interest of the USA. Quite the opposite. There is a reason why American documents state that the only real threat to the USA's dominance is a functioning Eurasian continent.
Ein funktionierender
Now listen up.
Kontinent ist. China spielt nochmal eine spezielle Rolle. Diese aus US-amerikanischen
China plays a special role. From the US perspective, the danger of good cooperation with China is averted for the time being. The only ones benefiting from this situation are the US and the arms industry. For the US, it is a success to have achieved their strategic goal. This goal, which has appeared in official documents for about 100 years, is to prevent or destroy prosperous cooperation on the Eurasian continent. Furthermore, they can sell their environmentally harmful and expensive fracking gas and have eliminated the cheap competition that we had right on our doorstep.
und haben die preiswerte Konkurrenz, die wir bequem vor der Nase hatten, ausgeschaltet. In Deutschland sind die Energiepreise so hoch, dass es für viele...
In Germany, energy prices are so high that it is becoming or has already become existentially threatening for many businesses. This is not because Russia has turned off the gas supply, as is often claimed. Rather, we have voluntarily given up Russian gas to avoid supporting the Russian war machinery. The crazy part is that we are still getting Russian gas, just through indirect routes and at a much higher price.
Und ein Vielfaches teurer. Bevor ich auf die angekündigte Bestandsaufnahme zu sprechen komme, mal wieder
Before I address the announced review, I would like to make an aside to avoid possible misunderstandings. When I criticize the policies of the USA, it should not be confused with anti-Americanism. I find the United States of America just as fascinating as Russia. My experiences with people during my travels across the continent have also been mostly positive. I believe it is legitimate for a country to primarily think of itself and pursue its interests.
Also seine Interessen verfolgt. Und dann erst überlegt, wie man das mit dem Wohl der Nachbarn verbinden könnte.
And then first consider how to connect that with the well-being of the neighbors. I find that acceptable, as long as one openly discusses interests and does not give them humanitarian pretexts to present them better. So far, so good. It only becomes concerning when an almost religious missionary zeal leads to taking the right to intervene violently, covertly, or openly anywhere in the world to pursue one's own interests. That contradicts.
Gewaltsam einzugreifen, eigene Interessen zu verfolgen. Das widerspricht allen internationalen Vereinbarungen und ganz massiv.
This contradicts all international agreements and massively the UN Charter. In the name of democracy, not everything is allowed. Now for the assessment. This includes the observation that the tragedy of Ukraine is not only reflected in the dead, injured, traumatized, and the indescribable destruction of the country. It also lies in the fact that an intelligent policy, as far as we know, could have prevented all this if it had been allowed. Brazilian President Lula da Silva aptly points out that Russia bears sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war, but by now the USA and Europe are responsible for promoting a proxy war.
Die USA und Europa verantwortlich für die Förderung eines Stellvertreterkrieges. Gerade mal 4 Wochen nach Ausbruch des Krieges hat es
Just 4 weeks after the outbreak of the war, there was a great opportunity to end it. Through the mediation of the then Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, negotiations took place in Istanbul. These were successful. Although not all points were clarified, the direction was clear. Above all, there was a willingness to resolve the disputes diplomatically, even regarding the complicated issue of Crimea. The whole thing did not fail because of Russia, but because ending the war at that time was not in the interest of the Western community of states.
Nicht im Interesse der westlichen Staatengemeinschaft lag. Das war das Ergebnis eines NATO-Sondergipfels in Brüssel am 24.
That was the outcome of a NATO special summit in Brussels on March 24th, 2022. Boris Johnson, the then British Prime Minister, made this clear to his Ukrainian counterpart during a lightning visit to Kiev on April 9th. The reasoning was provided by the American Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. He said that the opportunity must be taken to permanently weaken Russia militarily and economically through this war. So it was not primarily about the well-being of Ukraine. Thus, everything that had been achieved up to that point was rendered obsolete.
Erreicht worden war Makulatur. Und vor diesem Hintergrund muss man auch die teilweise.
Against this backdrop, one must also consider the demands of the Ukrainian president and his government for more and more military aid. If the Western states do not want the war to end, then they should help Ukraine endure the situation.
Imagine that, being a country that's ready to agree to no war with another country. They're all ready to go. Speaking, getting ready to sign that agreement, and then another country on the other side of an ocean says, no, we want the war to go forward.
As for the morale and perseverance of the Ukrainians, it is certainly still present. However, it seems increasingly clear to more Ukrainians that they are being sacrificed for geopolitical interests.
No shit.
Those who truly want to help the Ukrainians must ensure that this war stops.
Wenn man wirklich helfen will, der muss dafür sorgen, dass dieser Krieg aufhört.
So, for example, I'm on stage right now, I'm just talking, and Dinah sat there and she's now filming what I'm saying.
It's funny, over the handful, past couple of years, there is numerous speeches from Putin. You can find them saying that they want to negotiate. They don't want to be at war. They want to negotiate. You can look it up. Then you go look at how many Western corrupt lizard people have all said, we're not talking to him. Isn't that amazing? You realize how many people have died because of that? Because of those dirty, filthy sons of bitches? Boris Johnson needs to slowly roast over flames.
Dass das nach gut 2 Jahren Abnutzungskrieg
that the war of attrition will turn out less favorably for Ukraine after more than 2 years than before, keyword Istanbul, March 2022, is quite sad. But it was foreseeable. The assessment also includes the state of affairs at the front. It is well known that it is not easy to obtain reliable information in war, so caution is advised. The Ukrainian surprise attack, the so-called Kursk offensive, has apparently stalled. After initial remarkable territorial gains, it is not really progressing. Kiev's presumed calculation to tie down Russian troops from the south and provide relief in the Donbass has not worked out.
Also für Entlastung im Donbass zu sorgen, ist nicht aufgegangen. Moskau ist nämlich darauf nicht hereingefallen, sondern nur
Moscow did not fall for it. Instead, it is using the already existing Ukrainian weakness in terms of personnel and equipment to advance further in the Donbass. This area is much more interesting for Russia. The Russians are apparently on the verge of capturing the strategically important city of Bakrovsk. This city is strategically important because there is a railway junction there that plays a major role in supply. Almost more important is that there are hardly any fortified defense lines after that. What various military bloggers note is that the areas captured by Russia are now hardly destroyed compared to the beginning of the war.
Im Vergleich zum Beginn des Krieges kaum zerstört sind. Das lässt den Schluss zu, dass die ukrainische Gegenwehr.
This leads to the conclusion that the Ukrainian resistance is significantly weakening. The Ukrainian telegram channel Deep State, considered one of the most reliable Ukrainian sources, reports dramatic personnel issues in the southeast and significant material losses in the Kursk region. The British Times and The Economist report similar findings. Taken together, this does not suggest that Ukraine can hold out for much longer, especially considering the massive Russian airstrikes in recent days, which primarily target the destruction of infrastructure.
Infrastruktur zerstört wird. So schnell kann man die Stromversorgung und die Heizkraftwerke.
The power supply and heating plants cannot be repaired as quickly as they are repeatedly destroyed. The Ukrainian reports of successful defense are apparently embellished. According to the Ukrainian portal Defense Ukraine, which cites the current commander-in-chief, Ukraine was only able to intercept a quarter of the missiles fired by Russia and about two-thirds of the drones. However, Ukraine needs success stories to continue receiving support from the West.
Die Ukraine braucht aber Erfolgsmeldungen, um den Westen bei der Stange zu halten. Und je verzweifelter die Lage wird, umso größer.
And the more desperate the situation becomes, the greater the risk that panic, rather than reason, will dictate behavior. It is no secret that Zelensky and his government are doing everything possible to draw NATO into this war. Essentially, it is more of a theoretical discussion whether the West is a party to the war or not. According to the scientific service of the German Bundestag from March 2022, one does not become a party to the war simply by supplying weapons, but by training soldiers. By the end of last year, about 8,000 Ukrainian soldiers had already undergone training with the Bundeswehr.
Ende des vergangenen Jahres schon etwa 8.000 ukrainische Soldaten durchlaufen. Es hängt also schon lange nicht mehr von uns ab, ob wir Kriegspartei sind oder nicht.
It no longer depends on us whether we are a party to the war or not, but rather on how Moscow perceives our behavior. The situation could not be more deadlocked. It doesn't get better when those who call for diplomatic activities are more or less suspected of being on Moscow's payroll. It should be in Germany's and the EU's own interest to develop de-escalation concepts and work out a plan for the time after. However, these initiatives are not coming from Germany or the EU, but from China, African states, and Brazil. These countries would be far away if the situation here spirals out of control.
Dabei wären diese Länder weit vom Schuss, wenn die Sache hier aus dem Ruder läuft. Da würden Deutschland und die umliegenden Länder zum Schlachtfeld, nicht Brasilien.
Germany and the surrounding countries would become the battlefield, not Brazil or China, and not the USA either. Let's talk about détente policy again and take a look back. Since the late 1960s, NATO has pursued a dual strategy. On one hand, it demonstrated military strength, while on the other, it sought cooperation, détente, and disarmament on a political level. At that time, NATO's dual strategy towards Russia was described with the terms security and détente. Today, the corresponding terms are deterrence and dialogue. Deterrence is an aggressive term, while security is a defensive one.
Sicherheit ein defensiver Begriff.
The most financially successful people store money inside of an entity where there's no possibility of that capital.
Dialog. verkommt zur Leerformel, wenn man
Dialogue becomes an empty formula if you consider the interests of the other party illegitimate from the outset. Détente, on the other hand, represents a program, a comprehensive political approach. The difference in quality between politics then and now is evident just in the choice of terms. Speaking of choice of terms, I mentioned at the beginning that I would return to the topic of language. It is advisable, as a media consumer, to develop a certain sensitivity to language, to pay attention to word choice, and to avoid double standards. This does not only apply to the topic of Russia and Ukraine.
Und das bezieht sich nicht nur auf das Thema Russland und Ukraine. Wenn es sich zum Beispiel ungesicherte Nachrichten handelt und es die Guten geht.
If, for example, it involves unverified reports and it's about the good guys, it often says that such and such is apparently so and so. For the bad guys, the term apparently usually becomes the word allegedly. The doubt is then already clearly included. Or in a report about the Ukrainian advance on the Kursk region, it says that on August 8th, Ukrainian footage allegedly showed Russian soldiers surrendering. A little later in the same report, it says Russian footage is supposed to show how such and such happened. The following has nothing directly to do with Russia, but I still don't want to withhold this aspect from you.
Nichts direkt mit Russland zu tun, aber ich möchte Ihnen trotzdem diese Facette nicht vorenthalten. Wie weit ist die Verrohung gediehen?
How far has the brutalization progressed when the targeted killing of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders is referred to in the news as them being neutralized? The terms used were neutralized or even eliminated, not killed or murdered. Another example. There are established terms. This includes the illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if one is so precise in this case, why not consistently? Then it should not be called the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. That was and still is illegal under international law, but it is not referred to as such.
Das war und ist auch völkerrechtswidrig, wird aber nicht so genannt. Sie können sich sicher noch an den großen Unmut erinnern, als der ungarische Präsident
You can surely remember the great discontent when Hungarian President Viktor Orban, right at the start of his EU Council presidency, began an intensive travel diplomacy on the topic of Ukraine. You don't have to like Orban to recognize that this wasn't one of his worst ideas. But that's not the point now. Rather, it's about the news report stating that Orban met with Putin, Xi, and Trump. The Ukrainian President Zelensky, whom he met first, is simply omitted. That would disrupt the lineup of villains, so they just leave him out. With such means, whether automatic or deliberate, the very idea of reaching a solution is scorned.
Right? Die Idee, zu einer Lösung zu kommen, verächtlich gemacht. Denn was kann man schon erwarten bei Putin, Xi und Trump?
What can one expect from Putin, Xi, and Trump? Perhaps this, because it shows how much the mood in our country has changed. At the end of July, the Minister-President of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Manuela Schwesig, was asked about a possible Olympic bid by Germany as the current president of the Bundesrat. The last question to her was whether she thought it was right that Germany should not participate in the Games in Paris. Ms. Schwesig replied that the Olympic Games stand for peace. Therefore, it is right that Russia does not participate. How great must the pressure be for someone like Manuela Schwesig to make such a statement? If you take her wording seriously, then a whole range of other nations should also not participate.
Dann dürften eine ganze Reihe anderer Nationen auch nicht teilnehmen. Aber sie muss darauf achten, sich nicht mit einem falschen Halbsatz zu Russland.
But she must be careful not to make herself vulnerable with an ill-considered comment on Russia, as she is still criticized for her political support of Nord Stream 2. Currently, one cannot talk about Russia and Ukraine without mentioning the missile deployment in Germany planned for 2026. Some are firmly convinced that this will enhance our security. Others believe the opposite is true. It will not surprise you that I am among those who consider these plans a dangerous escalation. I would like to explain why in the following. The issue of deployment has at least two aspects: a military or security policy aspect and a democratic one. I will start with the democratic aspect.
Und ich fange mal mit dem Demokratischen an. Beim NATO-Doppelbeschluss 1979, als es die Aufstellung von
In 1979, during the NATO double-track decision, which involved the deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, not just in Germany, there was an intense parliamentary and societal debate. Even within NATO, there was controversial discussion. It took 4 years for the parliament to approve the deployment of the Pershing missiles, accompanied by the largest demonstrations Germany had ever experienced. Today, the situation is different. Unexpectedly, on the sidelines of the NATO summit on July 10th in Washington, a joint declaration by the USA and Germany is released. It states that starting in 2026, as part of the planning for their future permanent deployment, the United States of America will temporarily station long-range weapon systems of their multi-domain task force in Germany.
In Deutschland stationieren. Diese konventionellen Einheiten.
You imagine being a German citizen and hearing that's going down when you saw what just happened to the Ukraine for that shit going down there? It's hard to imagine, isn't it, being one of those citizens in neighboring countries over there with this shit show going down when we're, on average, mostly North Americans here on this channel, right? And we're just sitting here watching this shit go down. Safely, with a huge ocean on either side of us. No problem here, but my God, I could not begin to imagine the anxiety of being a family man, a citizen, watching what's going on right there. And this country that's oceans away wants to put long-range missiles like in that military land that's only like a quarter mile away from my home where my kids are playing soccer. After showing what happened when they did that in the Ukraine. Oh my God, could you imagine the frustration and not being able to make that stop?
These conventional units will include SM-6, Tomahawks, and currently developing hypersonic weapons when fully developed. These weapons have a significantly greater range than the current land-based systems in Europe. However, this far-reaching decision is not mentioned in the final declaration of the NATO summit. Instead, the declaration emphasizes NATO's commitment to arms control and disarmament. That's quite peculiar. Aside from the fact in the early 1980s, Pershings were stationed in 5 different European countries, if I'm not mistaken. Who then has command authority? Only the USA? Does Germany at least have a veto? Or
this is the coolest innovation of our lifetime. The world's first titanium non-stick pan. It's gonna blow your hair back.
Or are the missiles just stationed with us? And there's more to it. Although the impression is given that it is a joint decision, a closer look reveals something quite different. My colleague Wolfgang Lieb has meticulously compiled the exact details. You can find that on the internet, but I'll roughly outline the relevant facts for you now. Even under Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the USA fundamentally decided on such a deployment.
Die USA grundsätzlich für eine derartige Stationierung entschieden. Ab 2017 unter Trump wurde mit dem Aufbau einer
Starting in 2017 under Trump, the US Army began building a military task force structure. And that's the crucial point. Since April 13, 2021, long before the Russian attack on Ukraine, concrete preparations have been underway. It was decided to station one of the 5 multi-domain task forces in Wiesbaden. In other words, and I now quote my colleague Lieb, it was a long-prepared unilateral decision by the USA. The connection with the Russian attack on Ukraine is more about using the fear of Putin to stifle or prevent public discussion.
Putin eine öffentliche Diskussion zu lähmen oder zu unterbinden. Dem ist nichts hinzuzufügen. Und den ausführlichen Artikel kann ich nur empfehlen.
There's nothing to add to that. I can only recommend the detailed article. If we now change perspectives and look at the whole thing from Moscow's point of view, it becomes interesting. With hypersonic weapons reaching 17 times the speed of sound, the warning time is drastically reduced. What are the strategic implications of this? Does Moscow perceive this in the current tense situation as a defensive measure by the West, or rather as preparation for a surprise attack?
Oder doch eher als Vorbereitung für einen Überraschungsangriff? Und wenn damit dann zu rechnen ist, wäre es dann aus Moskau.
And if it is to be expected, wouldn't it be better from Moscow's perspective to take preventive action against it? Whether preventive or as a retaliatory strike, it will take place in densely populated German areas. As early as 1968, a military expert from the SPD pointed out a book that land-based systems belong in Alaska, Greenland, or some deserts, but certainly not in densely populated areas. In any case, I don't understand how this action is supposed to increase our security.
Nicht, wie sich dadurch, durch diese Aktion, unsere Sicherheit erhöhen soll.
Right? Nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Und offen gestanden,
Frankly, I also don't understand why people here aren't taking to the streets en masse to protest against it.
Right.
zu wehren.
Window lifters.
Die junge Generation, für die
The younger generation, for whom peace has apparently become something taken for granted, is so focused on climate change that there is no room left for the issue of war and peace.
No
It should be clear
shit.
to everyone. If peace doesn't work out, especially considering nuclear weapons, then the climate doesn't matter anymore either.
Vor allen Dingen angesichts der Nuklearwaffen, dann ist er mit dem Klima auch schon egal. Es ist ein bisschen schwierig, bei diesem Thema positiv oder mit einer Art Lichtblick.
It's difficult to end on a positive note with this topic. I'll try anyway.
Allein dafür, ne?
If we remember what is possible in terms of détente policy, we only need to think of the beginning of the new German Ostpolitik. This began immediately after the Soviet Union brutally crushed the democracy movement in Czechoslovakia in 1968. One could have said, we won't talk to them. Or as it's said today, you shouldn't talk to such people.
Das war brutal.
We need to teach them a lesson so that such actions don't go unpunished. But that's precisely when you should talk. The result of the new Ostpolitik is well known. For decades, there were only advantages for all involved, both humanitarian and economic. That's where we need to return.
Alle Beteiligten. Sowohl humanitär als auch wirtschaftlich. Da müssen wir wieder hin. Und jeder, der davon überzeugt ist, darf mit seiner Meinung sich nicht
And
verstecken.
anyone who is convinced of this should not hide their opinion. That can sometimes be uncomfortable, I know. You also can't rule out being quickly pigeonholed into a category where you don't belong. But that shouldn't stop you.
Vielleicht hilft dabei der Satz,
Perhaps the sentence by the cabaret artist Andreas Rebers helps.
was den falschen
If I say something right that pleases the wrong people, then the right thing doesn't automatically become wrong. I will now phrase the following somewhat solemnly.
Ich formuliere das
We owe it to our system, if we want to preserve it, our democratic system, not to hide our respective opinions, regardless of what they are.
mit unserer
We
jeweiligen
should do everything to ensure that this opinion is based as much as possible on information and not on ideologically driven beliefs.
auf Informationen beruht und nicht auf ideologisch bedingten Überzeugungen. Eine Gesellschaft, die auf ihre verfassungsrechtlich garantierte
A
Meinung
society that is justifiably proud of its constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech must cultivate a culture of debate. Otherwise, the theoretically guaranteed freedom of speech is worthless. People need to feel that it is perfectly normal to argue decently, in both senses of the word. I started with a quote and would like to end with one as well. This time from Jean Paul, the German writer who was even older than Heinrich Heine. He said, "One may be foolish with the permission of the authorities, but not wise without it." Thank you.
aber nicht ohne sie klug. Ich danke Ihnen.
There you go. There you go. Are you still saying, is there still people out there going, Russia invaded a sovereign country? Oh boy. Really? It's funny how she made the point about, students, young people are arguing about and fighting about climate change. What else? What else can you throw in there? Well, meanwhile, all this nasty, dirty, filthy shit is going on around the globe with missile bases, military bases sprouting up here all over the frickin' place, directly threatening people without a reason. who own nuclear arms. And meanwhile, the people who are funding it are arguing with each other about climate change, masks. What else? Transvestites, trannies, whatever you want to call them. No, I'm not saying against them. I'm just saying the dog shit topics that we are arguing about en masse when all this is going down. Could you imagine being one of those German... I've had a bunch of German nationals on my boat this last summer, and they were all of them going on and on about how Germany is just being shredded. Shredded. This past year, couple of years. I could not imagine the stress and the frustration of having some foreign country throwing down ballistic missiles in that patch of timber right over there about a quarter mile from the high school or the elementary school without even being able to do or say anything about it, and instantly becoming a number one target from this country over here that just did what they had to do to preserve their country. I can't imagine that stress. Can you imagine being one of those bordering countries with all this dog shit going down? Nothing you can do or say about it. And it's not even a mystery what'll happen, because you can just look at the Ukraine and see what happened to them from having bases put on their borders from a foreign country oceans away. That's what happened. Who's next? Right? Who's next? It's funny, they're not really showing all the Ukrainian people. I'm not seeing any video clips of the people of the Ukraine, their homes, really. Nobody's showing the crying children, the blown apart children that they normally show for propaganda, right? I'm not seeing too much of that. Anyway, there you go. I just thought people needed to hear somebody with receipts of what's really going down. Especially when you hear people going, Russia invaded a sovereign country illegally. Holy shit, you're not even in the parking lot. You're not even on the street that goes to the parking lot, let alone the game, when it comes to the information. And I feel sorry for you that you are so easily triggered to repeat that phrase without knowing any of the truth. Right? Why aren't you repeating what she's saying with the receipts? You can all look into it. But that's what's going down. There you go. There you go. On with my day. On with my day. What was I going to add? Not too much. What am I going to do now? I'm going to go out in the yard. I laced up the property of the trail cameras because something was going down the other night. And apparently something went down last night. Sarah said she took the dog out for a pee and she just about clotheslined herself. Freaking out. She said she heard footsteps heavier than humans. Thinks it might have been the big bear. So I'm going to go check the cameras and see what's up. I have a feeling it's just deer jumping away. Dunk, dunk, dunk. Right, she's not familiar with that sound. But we'll see. I'm going to go find out. And then tomorrow, I'll be back again with a whole pile of emails and truth to be heard. The food. Sarah and I are going to go load up my truck, possibly your car too, and get all of that food in here. If we can, I'll take a photo because I think she's got anxiety anyway, but she's a little worrisome on how we're pulling this off. And I'm like, just don't worry about it. We're going to get it done. It's no big deal. She can do 1 or 2 at a time, 3 at a time normally. It's just doing the exact same thing a bunch more times. So that'll be interesting. As far as putting these people on video, it's not going to happen. Right? Who needs that dog shit? Imagine being in a position where you're just having so much bad luck and then having that broadcasted on a frickin' YouTube channel to show the people just how bad you got it. No, you don't do that. Actually, last year one family wanted us to share a picture of their daughter. Big smile on her face with a big box of food there on the community page. We did that, but I wouldn't need that shit, right? If they want to come onto the channel and make a comment under a video sub and thank everybody, that's up to them. They can do that. I can suggest it to them, whatever. But it's funny, we had one person. See, Sarah chooses the household, and then she wants to know the ages of the kid, if they're allergic to anything, what they eat, what they need, the whole 9 yards to make sure this big package fits perfect with that home. And she contacts one woman. She's like, poor thing. She's she said she's going on and on. No, I didn't enter a lottery. No, this has got to be wrong. And she said, was she saying to her that there's got to be other people out there that are in need that should have this. And she finally finished her big rant, and then Sarah goes, no, your close friends nominated you, and I know your story. This woman has 3 or 4 kids, and the dirtbag deadbeat sack of shit that fathered them up and left them all a while back, left them with nothing. Don't know where he went. And she's got nothing. She's got these little baby mouths to feed. Could you imagine that? Hope that guy doesn't come back. But anyway, she is the one that said, no, I didn't enter a lottery. I didn't enter a lottery. Feeling guilty. Poor thing. I can't, I might even go on that delivery. I don't go on the deliveries because I can't handle it. I go on the deliveries, I'd probably grab all those kids and bring them home, right? And raise them. So, but I might go on the deliveries. Oh, I guess I'm going to have to this time. It's still a little over the top, but that's what's going down. If you want to contribute a few bucks, I don't know how to do it. I think there's a super chat thing. You can throw down money that way, or PayPal, I guess. Or I just thought how it started was using that membership money. Seeing that you could have a membership of the channel for a couple bucks, few bucks, and I'm like, oh, there we go. Extra money, let's feed kids with it. That's where it started, and that's where it is. So I don't even know. See, I'm a shitty marketer. I don't even know where the membership option is on the YouTube channel. I don't know. I'm sure you can find it. People are finding it. So if you know exactly where it is, put it in the comment section below. And there you go. Will this video stay up? I don't know. Haven't a clue. If it does, whatever. If it doesn't, well then I will edit it again and I'll take out the email shares and I'll put them in tomorrow's video with a lot more voices to be heard. There you go. All right? Sharing truth everywhere we go. Not just one topic.